Chapter 24, Section 3. Americans during the Depression were looking to Herbert Hoover for leadership. And Hoover remained relatively optimistic. Early on he even classified the Depression as temporary. But as the years went by and, the Depression wasn't temporary, Herbert Hoover wanted to ease human suffering. But many felt that the government shouldn't interfere in a free enterprise system. And Hoover agreed. Hoover agreed that the government shouldn't interfere, and he thought that recovery would happen through individual effort. But as the Depression got worse, many Americans started to demand federal assistance. Many wanted direct relief for the needy. That would mean if you need food, they help you get food. If you need clothing, they help you get clothing. You need shelter, they help you get shelter. Money, anything you need, they helped you get. Hoover refused to get involved. Hoover said the people should support the government, not the government support the people. And he believed the federal budget shouldn't be raised as much as it was going to take to do that. And what self-respect would people have that just took this aid? He thought people needed to work hard, use their strong character to get through this. This is an idea that becomes known as rugged individualism. The idea that success comes through individual effort and private enterprise. People will work hard and they'll get through this. People who needed more help, that's where the private charities, the local communities could provide the best help. Congress did decide that they should hopefully provide some relief. Robert La Follette Jr. and Edward Costigan proposed forming an aid board. The Federal Emergency Relief Board. And it would have $375 million for direct aid to the unemployed. Hoover comes out and says he refuses to support this. He will not support the FERB. Because of that, you have congressmen that won't vote for it. It fails by 14 votes from going into effect. Now, many Americans, they thought voluntary efforts would be better than government aid anyway. But it's very soon apparent that this won't be enough. The local resources, the local sources don't have the resources anymore. Nobody's contributing to those local charities. People don't have the means to do that anymore. In 1930, Hoover created the President's Committee for Unemployment Relief. Its job was to help out the state and local efforts. Encouraging people to donate to private organizations. Collect information about agencies, give it to the unemployed. Overall, though, the PCUR, the PCUR, really didn't do that much during Hoover's presidency. Hoover does think the government should play a little bit more of a role in the economy. The Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, he wanted the government to leave the economy alone. Businesses should deal with this crisis on their own. The strong ones will survive. Hoover rejected Mellon's advice, realizing that if they actually did this, unemployment was just going to keep going up and suffering was going to just keep increasing. Hoover, right after the stock market crash, he was in meetings with businesses, encouraging them to maintain their pre-depression levels of production and employment and wages. Hoover tried to boost Americans' confidence in the economy. But citizens grew increasingly doubtful of the administration, though, as he kept supporting the economy and being encouraging, and things just kept getting worse. One thing Hoover does is he requests public works programs, thinking that if he can, if the government starts doing some works, people will work there, stimulate business, reduce unemployment. His largest public works program was Boulder Dam being built on the Colorado River, which will eventually be renamed the Hoover Dam. Hoover also had public buildings built. He had highways built. Overall, Hoover spent about $800 million on projects. But in the grand scheme of the Depression, it really didn't have that much effect. Hoover wants to help farmers. 1929, Congress had passed the Agricultural Marketing Act, which set up the Federal Farm Board. The Federal Farm Board had a fund of about $500 million to try to stabilize prices, discouraging farmers from growing surplus crops. Farm cooperatives could borrow money to pay the cost of storing produce until prices would be high again. Overall, trying to reduce the volume of crops reaching the market. The government would buy some crops, store it till later. Hopefully this decreases the surplus. Problem is, farmers had people buying their crops now. They kept planting more because they were finally getting paid. So it didn't decrease the surplus. 1932, you got the Home Loan Bank Board, which is going to give money to banks for low interest loans. Hopefully this would help stop some of the foreclosures. Farmers could keep their land. Home construction maybe would be encouraged if people could get these low interest loans. You have the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 32. It would lend money to banks, railroads, other troubled institutions. It loaned out $2 billion during Hoover's years in office. But it really was a failure because it only truly helped large corporations. These loans had to be paid back in 6 months. The small struggling business, they can't do that. And look what year it was created, 1932. The Depression was already in full swing. A lot of those small struggling businesses, they were gone. Basically, by the time you get to 32, Hoover was one of the top hated men in the U.S. When you went to the movies and in the newsreel, if they ever had any pictures about Hoover or anything, audiences would boo. People hated him. And Hoover didn't care. He said, "This isn't a showman's job." You even start seeing some radical protests organized, especially by communist and socialist parties. They love to blame capitalism for the Depression, and they would organize these mass protests of unemployed men marching through the streets, and it wasn't always peaceful, sometimes ending in violence. One thing that does come out good of some of this communist and socialist party protests was they did help expose some racial injustices in the U.S. For example, in Scottsboro, Alabama, you got a trial of 9 African American boys that are sentenced to death on some very questionable charges. The Communist Party is actually going to step in and help defend them, and they organize demonstrations against this injustice. And as a result, eventually, all the boys are released. You started seeing some people arm themselves to prevent foreclosures. You saw some farmers that would actually block the roads trying to prevent food from getting to market, thinking that maybe this will help decrease supply and prices will go back up. But people were starting to take some of this stuff into their own hands. The last thing we need to talk about here is going to be the Bonus Army. 1932. The Bonus Army is going to march on Washington, D.C. It was made up of between 10 and 15,000 World War I veterans. At the end of World War I, there was a bonus promised to World War I soldiers. And at the time, the government says, we will pay this to you in 1945, this bonus. And at the end of World War I, a lot of veterans were like, that's fine. 1945, that'll be great. Pay us the bonus. It'll be about retirement age. That'll be great. Well, now they've marched to Washington, and they want their bonus now. They can't wait till 1945. They're struggling now. So they ask Congress for their bonus. Congress rejects their petition. The deal was 1945. Congress doesn't have a lot of this money right now. They're struggling as well. But Congress does offer to pay these veterans' way home. And all of them leave except for about 2,000 who set up shacks and tents near the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. When the police and some of these veterans clash, it ends up that 2 from each side die in this clash. Washington, D.C. declares that it is unable to maintain order and turns, control of this over to the federal government. So, July 28th, 1932, Hoover calls in the Army to have the veterans leave. General Douglas MacArthur is going to head up this Army group heading in there to have the veterans leave. MacArthur doesn't horse around. MacArthur comes in with tanks. The soldiers are armed. There's machine guns. They use tear gas. And the veterans are driven back. Hundreds are injured. 3 die. One of those deaths was an 11-week-old baby. As America wakes up the next morning and looks at their newspapers, people are angry. There's a sense of disbelief sweeping across the country about what is happening in our nation's capital.